Welcome to Berwick-upon-Tweed, the northernmost town in England, located just 2.5 miles south of the border with Scotland. Home to around 12,000 people, Berwick is far from the world's largest town, but there are few places which pack quite so much history into such a small space. On this 45-minute tour of England's most northerly town, we'll dive headfirst into all that history and more, exploring the streets, sights and sounds of Berwick as the sun rises on this winter's morning. We begin our walk on Marygate, the town's main street, at the end of which you can see Berwick's striking town hall. One of the icons of Berwick-upon-Tweed, the town hall was built in 1760 right at the heart of the town, replacing an older municipal building that had existed since the 13th century. That was Berwick's toll booth, a name common across Scotland for a town's administrative centre and the centre of all local activity, very much like a town hall. Today adorned with some sparkly Christmas lights, the town hall has served many functions over time, but is best known as the historic home of Berwick's town jail. Back when it was the toll booth, the building held everybody, from local ne'er-do-wells to political prisoners. When this town hall was built, each floor served a different purpose. The ground floor home to a couple of shops and jail cells alongside, the first floor the town's main assembly hall, and the top floor home to the most highly guarded prison cells. The town hall was in use as Berwick's main jail until 1849, but nowadays you can take a tour of the jail cells, which are still scarred with graffiti from 18th century criminals. Down by the foot of the town hall, meanwhile, we find a replica of the old town stocks. These were used as a punishment for minor misdemeanours, drunkenness, swearing and such. The stocks, originally located on the opposite side of the town hall, were used in Berwick from 1604 until well into the 19th century. As you can see, crime and punishment was at the centre of the town hall's role for much of its life, with jail cells located in the rooms down here on the ground floor, as well as up at the top of the building's tower. However, as we mentioned, the town hall was also an important part of Berwick's commercial sphere, with shops located on the ground floor in a part of the building today known as the Buttermarket. The name for this covered trading area comes from the fact that it was once the place to buy dairy products in Berwick, among a few other things. Once upon a time, this would have been one of the most bustling points for miles, as Berwick emerged as perhaps the most important town in the border regions. Historically, Marygate and the area around the town hall were the busy heart of medieval Berwick, a town which for centuries found itself in the crosshairs of the age-old conflict between England and Scotland. Looking up at the town hall from the end of Marygate, those centuries of international rivalry have shaped Berwick into a town like no other, with a fascinating local identity that combines both English and Scottish heritage into the essence of what makes Berwickers so unique. But before we talk more about the way that this town has been shaped by both England and Scotland, we need to take a look at where exactly Berwick is located on the map. As we mentioned, the town is the most northerly in England, lying just 2.5 miles shy of the Scottish border in the windswept northeastern corner of Northumberland County. Today, there's no question that Berwick is geographically located in England, but in the past, its status has been far more ambiguous. Once a Scottish town, Berwick has changed hands between the two nations as many as 14 times through history. At one point, though, the town's nationality was so fluid that it was in some cases regarded separately to both England and Scotland, a fact which has thrown up a number of interesting historical quirks. We'll talk more about that later on, as we pass by the King's Arms Hotel, a historic coaching inn which dates back to 1772. Because while Berwick spent much of its life in the medieval era ping-ponging between England and Scotland, the last few centuries have been rather more sedate, and the town saw the birth of a number of pubs and coaching inns, serving traffic passing between the two countries. Berwick was an important stop on the historic Great North Road, Great Britain's main highway that connected the cities of London and Edinburgh. The modern A1 roughly follows the route of the Great North Road, and until the 1980s, the A1 ran through the centre of Berwick, using its bridges to cross over the River Tweed. Walking down Sandgate here, we're dropping down towards the riverside, which is today crossed by 3 spectacular bridges, all of which serve as icons of the historic border crossing between England and Scotland. As for Sandgate itself, the street is lined with an impressive array of buildings, many built in the Georgian and Victorian eras, as Berwick reshaped itself from a war-torn medieval market town into a thriving coastal community, complete with theatres, eateries, shops and more. Looking at the architecture of many of the town's buildings, you'll see that Berwick has been significantly influenced by Scottish building techniques, largely due to the presence of local materials, and also from the time when it was itself located in Scotland. Berwick-upon-Tweed was last a Scottish town in 1482, before it was captured by English forces. As it had been at the centre of constant warring between the two nations for centuries, the town became surrounded by beefy protective walls, with just a few gates to enter, such as Shoregate here. Berwick's immense town walls date back at their oldest to 1296, when the English King Edward I, after having temporarily taken control of the town, drew a line around Berwick to ensure that the Scots would never capture it back. The walls were indeed built along this line, although Scotland did manage to take Berwick back a few more times. We now find ourselves on top of the old town walls, overlooking the River Tweed, which gives us a clue as to why both England and Scotland were so desperate to have control over this town. Historically, much of the eastern portion of the Anglo-Scottish border was formed by the route of the Tweed, which flows for 97 miles across the region, beginning in what is today Scotland, and exiting here, where it flows out into the North Sea. The Tweed has no relation to the classic fabric popularly worn throughout British history, but rather takes its name from an old Brittonic word that simply means border. Overlooking the river here, in the foreground we can see Berwick Bridge, best known as the Old Bridge. It was first built across the Tweed in 1624, serving as the first permanent stone river crossing at this point. Once upon a time, this was the bridge that was crossed by the Great North Road, before the much larger Royal Tweed Bridge behind it was built in the 1920s to carry the A1 road. Further behind both bridges, meanwhile, is a third bridge, the Royal Border Bridge. A huge rail viaduct built in 1850, it's another icon of Berwick, and we'll get a better look at it later on in our walk. However, we're first going to take a walk along the riverside from on top of the town walls, where we're able to look over the point where Berwick first emerged as an important medieval port town. Beneath us is Shoregate, which leads out onto a riverside area known as the Quayside. From the early medieval era, this was the most significant area in Berwick, as it connected the town to the wider world. Berwick, then a part of Scotland, traded extensively with continental Europe, in the 13th century primarily dealing in wool, the most highly desirable product of its time. The legacy of Berwick's port can be seen here with the old custom house, which was built in 1749, at a time when the port was busy trading products such as rum and mackerel, imports from Britain's ever-growing international maritime network. But while the port at Berwick was certainly well connected, dealing with far-flung trading partners from the Netherlands to Scandinavia and Russia, it was a fairly rudimentary operation in its early days. In the Middle Ages, the quayside is thought to have been little more than a muddy foreshore, and was only updated in the early 19th century as many of these houses overlooking it were built. The modernisation of Berwick's quayside in the industrial era helped to keep the town's port relevant in an ever more competitive age, and the town continued trading on this northern side of the River Tweed until the 1870s. After then, most trade moved to the Tweed dock on the south side of the river, while this side remained the commercial heart of the town on land. Originally, The busy area around Marygate was also where you would have found this impressive building, known as the Main Guard. Built in 1743, this historic guardhouse once stood on Berwick's main street, but in 1815 it was moved here to ease congestion in the centre of town. Since then, the building has taken on a variety of uses, from a small hostel to a storage house for a local grocer's, and then for the Coast Guard. But why exactly was a guardhouse like this built in Berwick? Well, this was actually one of 4 guardhouses that existed inside the town walls, and served as a combined area for holding local prisoners and for accommodating soldiers that were on duty enforcing curfews in the town during the night. As we'll see in a little while, Berwick has long been an important military stronghold, a reputation which comes from those centuries of warring that saw the town change hands between England and Scotland so many times. The town walls are among the best reminders of the long era of conflict that unfolded here, mostly built in the 14th century as war between England and Scotland was at its fiercest. Today, just a few fragments of those original walls remain, with the structure we're walking on now largely dating to a rebuild of the 17th and 18th centuries. As we mentioned, the walls were originally built under the orders of King Edward I, who captured Berwick for England for the first time in 1296. This began the long era of the town's nationality switching back and forth between the two, as a centuries-long game of capture the flag played out while Scotland vied to keep its independence from English aggressors pushing north. Before the first English invasion, Berwick had emerged as a fairly prosperous town with its port, but the fighting that unfolded left the town in an almost constant state of flux, always under threat from border raiders, large government armies, and being forced to regularly change the laws which it obeyed as it changed hands. By 1482, when the town was captured for the 14th and final time by England, that medieval economic prowess had been eroded somewhat. However, the English government then began to invest heavily into turning Berwick into a military fortress, giving it the walls that we know today. Amidst the blazing morning sun here is Coxon's Tower, built in the 1760s as part of the wider redevelopment of this part of the walls, but where a medieval fortification overlooking the mouth of the Tweed once stood too. The original fortification was made by the Scottish, before the English remodelled it over time as they took lasting control of the town. Today, the tower serves no military purpose, but it does afford a gorgeous view over the river mouth as it empties into the North Sea. In the distance on the left of your picture, you can see Berwick Pier, at the end of which stands Berwick Lighthouse, built in the 19th century. Unsurprisingly, the lighthouse is the northernmost in England, and looks over a harbour which has been busy with life for at least 2,000 years. However, not only has the mouth of the Tweed been a significant point for the local economy, but it's also an important haven for local sea life. If you walk out onto Berwick Pier, you might be lucky enough to see some of England's most diverse marine life, including everything from seabirds to salmon, seals, and on rarer occasions, orca and minke whales too. This house is named the Old Whaling House, which points towards the historic presence of whaling in Berwick, which actually took off in the 19th century. Though never the mainstay of the town's industry, whaling ships built in Berwick would venture into the northernmost reaches of the planet, the most famous of which was the good ship Norfolk, one of the final Berwick whalers that operated in the 1830s. At the time, Berwick whalers worked in competition with much larger scale whalers from around Scandinavia, a region with which this town has an interesting relationship. Like much of the Northumberland coast, Berwick found itself under fire from Viking raiders in the Anglo-Saxon period, while just a few miles to the south, the Vikings launched their infamous attack on the holy island of Lindisfarne, destroying the ancient priory in the first of their many raids on the English coast. Today, Berwick actually sits on a more northerly latitude than the Danish capital of Copenhagen, one of just a few places in England to do so, again showing us just how extreme the town's location is in the country. Berwick and the few square miles to its north are actually the only part of England to lie north of the River Tweed. At one point, when Berwick was a part of Scotland, the town across the river, known as Tweedmouth, was the northernmost town in England, but the two now form part of the wider town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. But while Berwick and Tweedmouth, along with the neighbouring area of Spittal, all form part of one modern town, the different areas have very different historical identities. Here in Berwick, locals are simply known as Berwickers, while across the river, Tweedmouth locals are nicknamed Twempies. What's more, the fact that Tweedmouth was never a part of Scotland, while Berwick once was, lends to a slight divergence in the two areas' historic national identity. That being said, however, residents from both sides of the Tweed do identify mostly with that unique Berwicker identity. But why exactly is the Berwicker identity so unique? Well, this is one of the few places in Britain where you'll find that many locals identify more with their town than any wider nationality. In a number of surveys asking whether the people of this town feel more Scottish or English, one of the most common answers has always been that people feel first and foremost like Berwickers. Now, as we continue along the town walls, we're approaching one of the most famous features of Berwick's extensive military fortifications, the Elizabethan Ramparts. Entirely unique in England, these fortifications run for about 1.25 miles and were built to completely surround the town. Built between 1558 and 1569, the ramparts were part of that heavy investment of turning Berwick into a military stronghold on the border, costing a grand total of over £128,000, which in today's money would amount to over £30 million. The ramparts are said to have been among the most expensive undertakings of the Elizabethan era, but proved crucial in the Queen's efforts to secure her power from the posturings of Scottish royals looking towards the English throne. For the people of Berwick, meanwhile, the ramparts brought vital security to the town, with the immense defences that we'll see in a moment making any recapture by Scottish forces, and a return to the historical ping-ponging of the town's nationality, a thing of the past. Today, the spectacularly preserved ramparts are used as a popular park in Berwick, with a walking route circling the town and offering views over both the Tweed and the North Sea, as well as a brilliant window into why this town was once so militarily important in the past. The medieval era saw almost constant conflicts between England and Scotland, but from the 17th century, the two countries were united in a personal union under the crown of King James VI and I. In 1707, meanwhile, the Acts of Union officially brought England and Scotland together into the Kingdom of Great Britain. So, you'd have expected that Berwick, once a vital border stronghold in a regularly disputed area, would have lost its purpose once England and Scotland joined together. However, that didn't prove to be the case, and in the 18th century, Berwick's military role became even more important, as the new British government faced increasing opposition and rebellions from inside Scotland. We're now looking over the edge of the ramparts, and you'll see that the fortifications are made up of a number of layers. The area where the playground is originally formed a ditch that surrounded these inner ramparts, while just beyond it is an exterior defensive wall that formed part of the grand defences. The core ramparts, which we're walking on top of now, were built to be at least 20 foot or 6 metres in height, with further earthwork on top, rising an extra 16 feet or 5 metres. The height of the ramparts made Berwick pretty much impenetrable for a group of Scottish raiders, but there was still danger, especially from within. The building before us is an old Gunpowder Magazine, built around 1750 to store the huge supply of gunpowder needed by the soldiers that were stationed here in Berwick. As you'll no doubt know, gunpowder is, deliberately, quite a volatile substance, and so the magazine was built with an extra wall around it so that it could absorb the impact from any accidental explosion of the gunpowder inside. As we mentioned though, much of this infrastructure was built after the union between England and Scotland. So what was it designed for? Well, while the Acts of Union brought together two old rivals into one nation, the marriage didn't get off to the simplest start. Throughout the 18th century, Britain was rocked by a series of uprisings known as the Jacobite rebellions. The rebellions, which had widespread support in Scotland and the northern reaches of England, demanded the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, which had given us King James I and King Charles I. The Jacobite rebellions created significant instability for the British government, and so strong military installations in areas potentially sympathetic to the Jacobite cause, like Berwick, were needed to quell any insurrections. Beneath us here, meanwhile, is a striking example of the well-preserved Elizabethan ramparts, this in particular being one of the large bastions built as part of the defences. Bastions were used as gun emplacements that allowed defenders to repel attacking forces on all sides, including those that had broken into the defensive ditch or made it to the inner walls. Originating from Italy, bastions were a highly advanced piece of technology in the mid-16th century, and Berwick was the first town in England to use them as part of its defences. All of this goes to show just how significant Berwick was in the view of successive monarchs and governments, and by the early 18th century, as the Jacobite rebellions were beginning to gather traction, even more military infrastructure was needed. In front of us are Berwick Barracks, a huge old military installation that was built by the British Army in 1721, and which served as the government's most imposing presence in the border region. This came in response to the first major Jacobite rising in 1715, which proved to be a far more widespread affair than the British government may have at first anticipated. While Jacobite sentiment was known to be widespread across Scotland, particularly up in the Highlands, the 1715 rising saw the Jacobite army press deep into northwest England, even making it all the way down to the city of Preston in Lancashire. The government managed to defeat the Jacobites on that occasion, but the ease with which the rebels had managed to push so far into England jangled nerves, which prompted the government to establish big new military installations like these barracks. Just opposite the barracks, we can see the other side of this huge arrowhead-shaped bastion, known as Windmill Bastion, which gave defending forces a 360-degree view of any onslaught towards Berwick. Along with the barracks, the 18th century saw the modernisation of the old town walls by the riverside, but the bastions were still very much a part of any defensive plan should Berwick find itself under siege from Jacobites. However, despite two further major uprisings in 1719 and 1745, Berwick never found itself besieged by Jacobites, and after the British government defeated the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the threat of further violence around Berwick looked like it was gone forever. That wasn't the end of the story though, and we'll now make our way off the ramparts to get a closer look at Berwick Barracks, before heading back into the heart of town to continue our walk. The end of the Jacobite risings brought stability to Scotland and the border regions in the eyes of the British government, but the nation was still keen to maintain its military strength in the face of foreign threats. Berwick Barracks remained a major military installation, in particular during the Napoleonic Wars, when the British government sought to ensure that every inch of coastline was well protected should Napoleon fancy an amphibious invasion in an unlikely spot. As I'm sure you know, however, that invasion never came, and after the Napoleonic Wars, Berwick Barracks was closed down for a few years. However, it was reopened later in the 19th century as the home of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, a British Army regiment that was originally formed way back in 1689. The Borderers remained in the barracks until 1963, at which point the installation became a historical monument to Berwick's military heritage. Once upon a time, The barracks were built to accommodate over 600 men, all of whom entered and exited through this grand central gate. Inside the gate is the barracks main square, which features the old accommodation ranges on either side, and in front of us the clock block, built in 1741 to replace the former ordnance storehouse. The barracks are a huge complex that once formed the most significant point of settlement in Berwick, but today are a fascinating place to visit once you've taken in the many sights on the streets of this captivating town. Just across from the barracks, we can also see two of the most important churches in Berwick. Behind the trees on the right is the Church of the Holy Trinity, the parish church of Berwick. Built in 1652, it's also a rare example of a church that was built during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. The money for the church was raised before Cromwell became Lord Protector, but as his policy suppressed England's bishops, no new churches could be officially consecrated at the time. Beside it, meanwhile, is St Andrew's Wallace Green and Lowick Church, which actually belongs to the Church of Scotland. Positioned beside Holy Trinity, of the Church of England, the two churches make up an almost unique pairing, with only 8 other Church of Scotland congregations found on this side of the border. This church was built in 1859, at which time it wasn't yet part of the Church of Scotland, only joining the denomination in 1971. Once again, this is a great example of how the local identity in Berwick is such a mixture of Scottish and English culture, and remains so to this day. As we walk out onto Church Street now, though, there's one question that many people wonder about when it comes to Berwick-upon-Tweed. Do locals speak with a Scottish or an English accent? Well, apart from the fact that there's no such thing as a single Scottish or English accent, your perception of the Berwick accent does depend a little on where you're from. To my ear, which you could probably tell comes from a few hundred miles south of Berwick, the local accent certainly sounds a lot more Scottish than the Geordie accents you find across Northumberland. On the other hand, many Scottish people would hear the Berwick accent as a lot closer to Geordie, as the locals here speak with a fascinating blend of characteristics from both Scots and Geordie. Don't worry, I won't subject you to my attempts at the local lingo, although it's been said that, in recent years, the Berwick accent has begun to move ever closer towards Geordie. Geographically, Berwick is actually located closer to Edinburgh than it is to Newcastle, but it's thought that successive generations have been gravitating towards Tyneside more regularly, perhaps leading to this gradual shift in the dialect. Making our way off Church Street now, there's another interesting story that has been thrown around when it comes to Berwick's separate identity from both England and Scotland. Given its history as a disputed territory, and the potential for the town to change hands once again, Berwick has been referred to separately from both nations in numerous important documents. One example of this came in 1853, when Britain declared war on Russia in the Crimean War. On the declaration, Queen Victoria is said to have signed her name as Victoria, Queen of Great Britain, Ireland, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and all British dominions. However, when the war came to an end in 1856, the concluding Paris Treaty didn't mention Berwick-upon-Tweed anywhere by name. This led to the frankly hilarious situation in which Berwick-upon-Tweed, this town of a few thousand people, supposedly now stood alone in a war against the Russian Empire, possibly the biggest David and Goliath matchup in all of history. Fortunately, the war unfolded without any casualties, mainly because nobody knew it was going on. But in 1966, 113 years after Berwick had declared war on Russia, the conflict came to an end, as the mayor of Berwick signed a declaration of peace alongside an apparent Soviet official. On signing the declaration, the mayor said to his counterpart, "You can tell the Russian people that they can now sleep peacefully in their beds." All this would have made the conflict between Berwick and Russia the 43rd longest war in history. But sadly, the story isn't actually true. Queen Victoria never signed her name as Queen of Berwick-upon-Tweed on that occasion, and the Soviet official who came to sign the peace treaty was actually a journalist from the London branch of Pravda. The story is believed to have been invented around 1914 by a journalist in New Zealand. And while the Mayor of Berwick almost certainly did meet a Pravda journalist, no copy of the Declaration of Peace exists, and no peace parades were held on Marygate after Berwick-upon-Tweed had managed to see off the might of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. That being said, the legend is a brilliant tale of the little town that could, and it's a quirk of history which always gets people interested in Berwick's fascinating position on this historic border. We're coming back onto Marygate now, which looks a little busier than when we started our walk about half an hour ago. From here, we'll make our way back towards the River Tweed, and then circle back around to walk up to the top of Marygate, where we'll see Berwick's railway station, the northernmost in England, and the ruins of Berwick Castle, the northernmost in... well, you get the picture. Across the road from us is the Brewer's Arms, one of a number of pubs to be found on Marygate. As we mentioned earlier, many of Berwick's pubs were built to cater to passing trade going up the A1, which once followed this road through town. Once again, we can see the town hall down at the bottom of Marygate, while much closer to us on the left is the old home of the local paper, the Berwick Advertiser, originally built in 1900, and which was home to the newspaper all the way until 2014. This brings us onto the busy Golden Square, which greets drivers as they enter central Berwick, having crossed over the Royal Tweed Bridge. This is perhaps the easiest way to get back and forth between the two sides of the Tweed, and a walk over the bridge affords more great views of the river, as well as the two other bridges that stand beside it. Speaking of the river, the Tweed is said to be one of Britain's great salmon rivers, and is one of the most accessible for angling. Central Berwick may not be the calmest place to go fishing, but if you venture further upstream, there are countless wonderful spots where you can get a good catch or two. Salmon actually plays an important role in the local area, not only lending its name to pubs like the Leaping Salmon here, but also being a part of one of the most fun local traditions you'll find anywhere in Britain. One of the big annual events here in Berwick is Salmon Week, a festival that celebrates the town's long history of salmon fishing on the Tweed. Held in July, some say that Salmon Week has been held since 1292, and its main event is the crowning of the Salmon Queen. Though this particular event began more recently in 1946, the crowning of the Salmon Queen is a fantastic local tradition, in which the children of schools across the water in Tweedmouth vote for one girl to be that year's Salmon Queen. In a fantastically lavish celebration, the Salmon Queen is carried in a traditional fishing coble boat behind marching bagpipes in a procession that starts at Berwick Town Hall, travels over the Old Bridge, and finishes at the Queen's Gardens just beneath the Tweed Bridge. But the Salmon Queen isn't the only person who's been acclaimed in Berwick's recent history, as this statue on Bank Hill shows us. It depicts Lady Jerningham, the wife of an MP for the borough, and who was a major philanthropist to the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. She died in 1902, but this monument was erected the following year in her memory, overlooking the River Tweed from this high point on the town's riverside. Here, meanwhile, we find ourselves looking up at the westernmost extent of the Elizabethan Ramparts, which also stand over the Tweed. From this point, we can get a really good view of the two newer bridges that span the Tweed, with the impressively constructed Royal Tweed Bridge busy with traffic, and 13 of the arches of the Royal Border Bridge standing tall over the river. Despite the rail bridge's name, it has never marked the crossing point of the Anglo-Scottish border, even though the river here was indeed once the border, before England took control of Berwick. It was, however, a vital development in linking England and Scotland by rail, and today still sits on the busy East Coast main line, served by high-speed trains. We'll talk more about Berwick's position on the rail network when we pass the station, but here we find a rather interesting little landmark, an old public toilet. Opened in 1899, this is a rare remaining example of a Victorian ladies' toilet, which was deliberately designed to look like a cute cottage in order to obscure the reason why people would go inside. Once again now, we're coming back out onto Marygate, but we'll now make our way beyond the part of the street located within the old town walls, walking through the archway of Scotsgate. This gate was built as part of the Elizabethan Ramparts, which replaced King Edward I's medieval town walls on the north and eastern sides of Berwick. Today, Scotsgate is a scheduled ancient monument and Grade 1 listed, making it one of the most important landmarks in town and ensured to be well protected into the future. On this side of the ramparts, Marygate becomes Castlegate, the street's name telling us exactly where it leads, Berwick Castle, where we'll be ending our walk in around 10 minutes' time. Though we now find ourselves on the outside of the ramparts, Castlegate was still part of the old town centre, surrounded by the original medieval walls which linked up to Berwick Castle, which stands beside the river on the northern edge of town. While Marygate is very much the busy centre of Berwick, home to all the big high street chains, Castlegate is home to a row of independent establishments. You'll find the traces of old pubs, along with a few ones still operating today, as well as the local chip shop, restaurants, and a good few houses too. Up at the top of the street, there's another church. It's St Mary's Church, which, between 1858 when it was built and 1989 when it closed for worship, was the northernmost church in Berwick, and ipso facto, the northernmost church in England. Of course, you can play the northernmost game until the cows come home in Berwick. In fact, speaking of which, before the old St Mary's Church stands the northernmost war memorial in England. Topped with a majestic statue of Athena Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, the memorial was unveiled in 1923 in remembrance of the local men who lost their lives fighting in the First World War. Interestingly, the figure of Athena Nike was actually modelled on a nurse who served in the war, and the statue's stoic demeanour is meant to represent the bravery of the women of Berwick who also contributed so much to the war effort. Continuing further up towards the top of Castlegate, we're approaching Berwick-upon-Tweed Station, which is today one of the most important transport links in the border region, allowing direct, high-speed access from this town to the capitals of both Scotland and England. As we mentioned earlier, Berwick Station sits on the East Coast Main Line, which connects London and Edinburgh. The station here was opened back in 1846 and was originally the terminus of a line from Edinburgh, served by the North British Railway. A year later, a temporary viaduct allowed the line from Newcastle to link up with Berwick, before the majestic Royal Border Bridge was built over the Tweed. Ultimately, this put Berwick at an important point on the epic 393-mile rail route from London to Edinburgh. Today, high-speed trains between the two cities stop regularly here in Berwick, which can also be directly accessed from cities across the country, all the way from Inverness to Plymouth. That makes Berwick-upon-Tweed, despite its extreme location in England, fantastically easy to reach wherever you live in the country. And as we've seen on this walk, there's a whole lot to see if you come to the town for a day out. But as we walk over the railway, one thing you sadly won't be able to see anymore in Berwick is the historic Great Hall of Berwick Castle. Berwick's castle was once one of the most formidable and politically significant castles in Britain, and its Great Hall stood where the train station is today, sadly having been demolished back in 1847. What that means, however, is that when you're standing on the platform waiting for your train at Berwick, you're standing where kings of England and Scotland once stood, from the famous Robert the Bruce to King Edward I. But while the remains of the Great Hall may no longer be visible, you can still see parts of Berwick Castle, which was originally built way back in the early 12th century. Now at the top of Castlegate, we'll make our way down towards the Tweed through Coronation Park, which features the last ruins of Berwick Castle, the jewel in the crown of England and Scotland's centuries-long game of capture the flag. The castle was first built in the 1120s when Berwick was a part of Scotland, under the orders of King David I. The castle fell into English hands a few decades later, before being sold back to Scotland, in the first of many exchanges to come. It was also here that King Edward I was judged to be the King of Scotland in 1292, in a dispute with Robert the Bruce, which began the centuries of fighting over this town, the castle being the prize that symbolised a victory for whichever nation won that week. Sitting just outside the medieval town walls, the castle eventually became redundant once the Elizabethan Ramparts were built, and it began to fall into ruin. Much of its stone was taken for the construction of other buildings in town, including the parish church that we saw earlier. Today, all that remains is what we see here, the old curtain wall of the castle, which snakes down towards the banks of the Tweed. And it's here, beneath the prize that everyone wanted when Berwick was the most sought-after town in Great Britain, that we've come to the end of our walk around this enthralling town. Best known as the northernmost town in England, and famous across Britain for its unique local identity, the star of a number of historical quirks and some of the most spectacularly preserved military heritage in the country, Berwick-upon-Tweed is a place overflowing with history at every corner. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this tour, and I hope you get the chance to visit Berwick-upon-Tweed for yourself too.